Thanks for joining us for tonight's event. My name's Kevin. I'm one of the event hosts here at Powell's Books. And before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. And if you don't already do so, please follow us on social medias such as Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, as well as our YouTube channel. Tonight, we're excited to welcome Mesha Maren in conversation with Gabriel Bump. In Perpetual West, Alex and Elana are a young married couple that moved from small town Virginia to El Paso, intent on a new beginning. Mexican by birth, but adopted by white American Pentecostal parents, Alex is hungry to learn about the place where he was born. He spends every free moment across the border in Juárez, perfecting his Spanish, hanging with a collective of young activists, and studying Mexican wrestling for his graduate work in sociology. Meanwhile, Elana, busy fighting her own demons, feels disillusioned by academia and has stopped going to class. And though they are also best friends, Elana has no idea that Alex has fallen in love with Mateo, the lucha libre fighter. When Alex goes missing and Elana can't determine whether he left on his own accord or has been kidnapped, it's clear that neither of them has been honest about who they are. Spanning their journey from Virginia to Texas to Mexico, Mesha Maren's thrilling follow-up to Sugar Run takes us from missionaries to wrestling matches to a luxurious cartel compound and deep into the psychic choices that shape our identities. Perpetual West is the sweeping novel that tells us as much about our perceptions of the United States and Mexico as it does about our own natures and desires. It's also an engaging look at the false divide between high and low culture and a suspenseful story of how harrowing events can bring our true selves to the surface. Mesha will be joined in conversation by Gabriel Bump, author of the novel Everywhere You Don't Belong. Author Adam Levin calls Gabriel's book, quote, startling, original, and hilarious, unquote. And Noe Holland calls it a, quote, brilliant and harrowing debut, unquote. We thank Gabriel for being part of tonight's event. This event will also include an audience Q&A. You can use that Q&A box button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question at anytime during the event. And if someone has typed a question that you'd like to know the answer to, you can even upvote those particular questions. Perhaps most importantly, please support Mesha and Powell's by purchasing a copy of Perpetual West from us. A link to buy that book, as well as a link to buy Gabriel's book, will be shared in the chat a couple of times this evening. Mesha, Gabriel, we're so excited to welcome you both tonight. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Hey, Mesha.
Hey, thank you so much to Powell's, and thank you to Gabe, and thanks to everybody who's here tonight. And sorry, I was sick on our original date for this, and I'm very happy that I'm feeling much better and like super excited to be here tonight with all of you.
Yeah, I think we're all happy you're feeling better.
Yes. Luckily.
Yeah. But yeah, so I'm glad that we could move around, and
Yes.
honest, I'm so excited to talk about this really, brilliant book, and also about like your other work too, right? Like first book and then kind of what you're working on now. But before we jump in and start, do you want to read a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I thought that what I'll do is I'll read a real short little section, and then I have a little 7-inch here that I'm going to play for you all too, that ties into the book a little bit. I've been working through ways to try to make these virtual events feel like more, I don't know, like tangible for me. Like everything is so happening out here, and it's so hard to touch. So I've been working through ways to try to kind of like tie it to certain experiences for myself. So I'm going to read a bit from a section that takes place. It's only about 30 pages in, but it's with the character Mateo, who, as in the intro that you just heard, he is the lucha libre fighter. He's a professional wrestler. And when we meet him here on page 32, He is he's in a hotel. He's leaving his hotel room, and he's kind of trying to work through this relationship that he has with this guy who is his sponsor, who kind of pays to promote him. But he's realizing that this relationship has gotten more and more complicated in certain ways. So I'll just read a bit and you'll get a little taste of his perspective. The hallway was empty. In the elevator, a housekeeping girl with a feather duster in her hand looked at his face, looked away and then back again, and he remembered burst blood vessels in his eye, swollen cheek, and stitched up brow. Mateo smiled, glad she was there because it made the elevator feel less like an extension of the box rooms of his dreams. This whole hotel was too dark, too quiet. He got out on the ground floor and there were two men in the lobby, both in black jackets, waiting for someone. Mateo's blood spiked. So he's wondering at this moment, Neto, he's about to reference Neto. Neto is his sponsor, and he's wondering, is he being followed? Is this just in his mind? What demons are real and what he's imagining? Neto's men, he asked himself, he couldn't be sure. Neither man met his eye. He walked quickly past the almost empty dining hall where bored waiters in long black aprons paced the marble tiles, and on past the front desk, through the double glass doors, a jackhammer in the street, swerving traffic, ding of a bicycle bell. He looked back. Neither man had come outside. He turned onto Puebla Avenue and broke into a run. They probably had nothing to do with him. He slowed his pace. They had looked like Neto's men, though. He glanced back again, saw nothing, and turned east. He was moving instinctively toward Arena Mexico, where he had fought the night before, but when he hit the crossroads at Cuauhtemoc, he took a left. There was a gym for all the Consejo Mundial fighters at the Arena Mexico, but he did not want to go there as he always did. He headed instead to a gym he had not been to in years, Gimnasio Victoria, where he had trained when he arrived in DF. That was back when his Juárez trainer had sent him to the capital to live and work with El Águila, who owned the Victoria gym and knew people in the Consejo Mundial. And it had all worked out, all his biggest hopes. He'd gotten his license and then he'd been contracted by the Consejo, but it never felt as good anymore as it used to, up north in the beginning. His first big fight had been in a shitty gym on the outskirts of downtown Juárez, a concrete room with a leaking roof, puddles of water, and an audience so alive, their hate and love so palpable you could see it, snaking up and out of them, tentacles of rage and pride rising and twinning. This was in the NAFTA years, when the North was filling with maquiladores and factory workers blowing here and there for work. The North, so far from the capital that the heart pumped almost no blood up to it, had been tossed like a scrap to the capitalists. It had been nearly lost in the 1840s, cracked in half and abandoned, and then nearly lost again to the free trade agreements. But as the avenger of the North, and that's Mateo's, the name he fights under as a wrestler. As the avenger of the North, Mateo was the fierce fronterizo pride, puro norteño to the core, a shining golden sun. He had not thought of wrestling as a career in the beginning. He thought he wanted to be a musician. From his school janitor job, he'd go straight to band practice with his friend Lalo after work. Lalo had introduced him to some local hardcore groups, Hijos de Maquileros and the Reina Roja, and he'd played him LPs from Masacre, Seis Ocho, Los Crudos, Limp Wrist. They'd started their own three-piece, La Plaga, with Mateo on bass, and he'd always known he had no real talent. He did not do it for the music, but for the deep belonging he felt listening to David from Hijos sing about growing up poor and proud, and the electric goosebumps he got when Martin Crudo screamed about being queer. Then one day, after band practice, Lalo invited Mateo along to a lucha training session, and he felt it in his body, even on that first night, that this was what he was good at. He threw himself into it, hour after hour with his trainer, Baby Sharon, watching, pushing, correcting. Baby Sharon saw how important it was to him and let him pay next to nothing for classes. He focused on it for whole days in that tiny, muffled gym with the old timers sitting on the edge of the ring, nursing warm cantablancas and calling out to him, "No, así, mijo." Their hands fluting up like startled birds to show the rolls and pins and flips their own bodies were too crippled to hold. So I'll stop there, and I'm just going to play a teeny bit of Los Crudos for you all, because I feel like it's something I reference in the book, and it's hard to get a real taste of. And before I play it, I just want to, so Los Crudos is like a hardcore band that was started by this amazing guy, Martin Sorondagay, in the 90s out of Chicago. And he's a Uruguayan immigrant who, you'll hear the music and it's difficult. The words are in Spanish, but even so, even if you understand Spanish, they're screaming. It's hardcore music. It's hard to understand. But they have these really amazing, uplifting lyrics, which I think is what I had the character of Mateo really kind of responding to. So they're singing about things like some of their lyrics are like, what we want, it will come through our efforts and actions. What we want, they are solutions for a global crisis, free markets and globalization, a trap of exploitation and destruction, control of land and workers. What we want, it will come through our efforts and actions. The power is in our hands. Fight back. So there's just these awesome guys, and I'm just going to play a short, tiny bit of it so you can kind of get a taste here. All right. I think my dog says he's done with the hardcore. So Okay.
Let's rock. Yeah, that's rock. Well, I think like that's actually a pretty. Well, first, I love that record player too.
This is yeah. I mean, I just got it at Target, but it's very you can travel with it. It's very
Yeah, that's
useful.
wonderful.
Yeah.
So what's like? All right. So I think with this book, and I'm kind of like happy that you started off that way too, because this book like contains so much, right? And even like imagining that there's like a heavy metal soundtrack to it is like even kind of surprising. Like this book is just like full of surprises in this way, and I feel like the initial surprise, like even when, because I loved your first book, Sugar Run, like, and I read it and I heard that you were writing another book, and then heard what your next book like is about. I was totally floored and blown away. Because if you haven't read Sugar Run yet or aren't familiar with kind of Misha's work outside of it, like I consider you of like the quintessential like Appalachian writer, right? Of course, there's Appalachia and West Virginia, like in this book, but there's also American Mexican relations, wrestling, cartels, right? There's like high academic theory
Mm-hmm.
in it, and then there's like sexuality, right? And so, and now there's heavy metal, right? Like behind the words. And if you could just maybe take us from the beginning, like how did you even get the idea for this book? Like what was the genesis of it?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for everything that you just said. Yeah. So the funny thing about this book is that the genesis of it, the kind of ideas for it, started actually before Sugar Run, and started back in. So the book is set in 2005, and the very early ideas for the book started in 2004, 2005 in my life. And the characters, Alex and Elana, are both right around 21 years old, and Mateo is a little bit older, but they're all right around that age. And when just after my 21st birthday, I took a Greyhound bus from Asheville, North Carolina to El Paso, Texas, to go and meet up with a woman that I was deeply in love with. And she was doing a study abroad, a quick exchange program. She was in school in St. Paul, but doing like a semester abroad in Juárez. And she had moved down there, and I was kind of finishing up some stuff in Asheville, and took a Greyhound bus out there. And really at that point, I was just moving out there for her. Like I just wanted to be close to her, and I didn't know anything about that region, and like hadn't put a ton of thought into it besides the fact of moving there for her. And when I got there, she picked me up at like midnight at the Greyhound bus station and took me across the border. She was living with a host family in Juárez. But she wanted first to introduce me to this new friend of hers, who was this young punk activist, also like professional wrestler in training, and this like, new friend of hers. And as soon as she introduced me to him, I was like, there's something going on between these people. And I tried to deny it for a little while, but long story short, this wrestler stole my girlfriend from me. And I was deeply heartbroken, thought I would never get over it, as you do when you're 21 and you just, think that like your heartbreak is the center of the entire universe. But I also fell in love with that area. So I was living in El Paso, and I was working with a group called La Mujer Obrera, that is a community organizing group that started there after NAFTA, when there were a lot of factories on the US side, particularly like garment factories that made jeans and shirts, and paid something close to a living wage on the US side, but then after NAFTA, they moved their factories south of the border and started paying like pennies to the dollars of what they had been paying. And so I was working in a little cafe that was part of this collective of businesses run by La Mujer Obrera. And as my heart was being broken, I also was like really, as I said, falling in love with the place, with El Paso and Juárez. And to my own surprise, finding that like there were a lot of similarities between Appalachia and that particular area of the border, even though on the surface, West Virginia and, southern Texas, northern Mexico, like they look very different. And I thought that there were just going to be so many differences, and there are, but there's also so many similarities. Everything from the fact of like extraction economies, both in terms of like actual like extraction of minerals, but also the extractive processes of using labor and paying almost nothing. And the fact that like both Appalachia and particularly West Virginia and that area right there on the border, they're difficult places to love, but for the people who do love them, we love them very, very deeply. And I kind of felt this parallel there. And so my heart was being broken, but my mind was being opened. And I felt like it was this time of like deep, like personal processing, but also coming to this awareness of the relationship the US has to Mexico and all of these things. And I knew that I wanted to try to capture that in writing. And I thought for a very long time that I would capture it in nonfiction. I thought I would write about my own experience, and I tried to write essays. I tried to write literally about that experience, and for whatever reason, it just wasn't working. The flavor of my experience there wasn't coming across in nonfiction, and so I kind of set it aside and focused instead on Sugar Run, and I wrote that novel. And then after that novel was out of my hands and into the hands of the people at Algonquin and kind of moving along in that process, I turned back to thinking about writing about this time in this place, but I started to think about it in more of a fictional way, and it started to work better. And then I actually looked like, one of those days when I was supposed to be writing on the novel, but I was not, and I went on Facebook instead. I looked up the guy who had stolen my girlfriend from me, and he's like a pretty famous wrestler now. And I looked him up on Facebook and sent him a message, and he remembered me, and he became really integral to my process of researching the novel. And he was extremely generous. So they're not together anymore, but I'm friends now with both of them. And he was super generous. Like I went down to Juárez and spent time with him, and he showed me around. And then he also spends a lot of time in Mexico City, because that's where a lot of the lucha libre promotion companies are centered out of. And so I spent also weeks there hanging out with him, interviewing him, and also just watching him. And he was so generous in just allowing me to ask him any questions, but also just to spend time with him and take notes. And so that's kind of where it came from.
Yeah. And I get, like, it is interesting to hear that story and then also know the shape, like the fictional story it's taken, right? Like this, like the academic background, right? So there's like this high-minded academy stuff, right? Like Elena's working on like graduate work, right? And I wonder, well, because there's that aspect, which is, I assume, is taken from the fictional, but then like even that story, that love triangle, seems interesting enough, right? Yeah. For fiction, but you don't leave the fictional story there, right? There's it turns into this like kidnapping cartel drama, and so I wonder what was the inspiration to add that change into the fictional, and to not just make it like this love story, but why make it kind of this like badass Borderlands like cartel epic, right?
Well, right. So I think I have like two answers to that. The first is that as I was spending time with the wrestler, Pagano is his name, and you can look him up. There's a lot of like YouTube videos. He's amazing. He's an amazing performer. When I was spending time with him, he started talking about the ways that the cartel was influencing the wrestling world, and how like it was covert, but it was there, as in like they were spending money and kind of flexing power, but not in the ways that, a beer company might sponsor somebody and splash their name all over the place. And powerful men from the cartel aren't going to do that. They don't want their name all over the place, but they want the power and the control. And Pagano was just talking with me about the way that it seeps into life, just every level of life. And honestly, at a certain point when I was writing the book, I felt as if it were dishonest to not have that be a part of a story taking place in Juárez in 2005 and going forward. I think I shied away from it a bit at first because I do think that there's ways in which talking about the cartel in Mexico can feel cliche or can feel like that's not the part of the story I want to engage with. But when I was honest with myself and listened to what Pagano was saying to me, I realized that people don't always want to talk about it, but it is, for long-term residents of that area, it is such a part of life there that to shy away from it would actually be dishonest. So I started to just kind of sit with that and be like, all right, well, what would it be like to be in a place where, it's part of the air you breathe and you choose to engage with it more or less. And then I started to get interested in the idea of, so, kind of part of what I was reading there from and what you see in the book is that Mateo sort of steps into the world of the cartel slightly unknowingly. And then when he looks back, he realizes all the steps he took that led him to where he was. And this was sort of the story that I was hearing kind of told to me. The other half of the answer to your question is like, I always deal with plot and structure last. So what comes to me first in fiction is images and then characters. So it started with this image of this car arriving at the border and these two young people inside. And I started to work with those characters and then realized there was another character on the other side of the border. And it always kind of begins like that. And I'll have like a whole first, sometimes 2 drafts that are just longhand written in notebooks that don't have a lot of plot, like they're just characters. And then when I start to put the plot in there, that always kind of comes later. And with both Sugar Run and Perpetual West, like there ends up being these kind of dramatic plot aspects. And they always come later. And I feel like it's a different part of my brain that like clicks in and starts to do that work. And then I guess I just hope that it fits together. But like the character stuff and the plot stuff, like, yeah, match
I guess
up.
it's like filling, like the plot is just kind of, I don't know, so you put the decorations on the wall, but then you build the walls like around the decorations.
Right. It is, I mean, because when I think about plot, I'm like, okay, so the thing that's interesting to me about like a really dramatic plot point is like what it does for the characters. Like when I put my characters, my poor characters, I'm sorry for them, but I put them in these like bad situations because I'm really interested to see what they will do. And in a way, I'm less interested in the situation. I'm more interested in like the psychological interiority of the characters. What happens to Alex and Mateo when they end up interfacing with this powerful man?
Well, and you can really tell how much you care about your characters because I am, and I imagine most people reading your work like are most interested in like how they react to things, not necessarily what's happening.
Yeah.
But it's this awesome sweet spot where it's like, okay, they're in this kind of high stakes situation. They wake up in like a dark room and there's blood everywhere, but you want to like know how the characters are responding, not just like what the situation is. And I think that like what also you can tell this from the section that you read too, which is on a sentence level. There's just so much like beauty in this book.
Thank you.
And I feel that that does achieve this really cool balance between like beauty on the sentence level and like horror on the page, if that makes sense, right? Like, on the whole page and like horror on the sentence level. Yeah, so I think it's a brave book in a lot of ways because it's so big. Like there's nothing safe about it. And I wonder if you were ever in the writing process like worried about that, I guess, like worried about going so big. You can talk about how you kind of overcame those fears, because I'm really glad that you did. And I think that like I don't know, like we both teach young writers, right? And I feel like well, maybe not with all, but with a lot of young writers, like they don't want to be too brave, right? They don't want to like go for the big thing and try and pull it off, or stick with it enough to pull it off. And I don't know, I wonder, like, how do you talk to your students about that? Like, how did you kind of overcome that fear?
Yeah.
Let alone the fact that you're right, like, let alone the fact that like you're like a white person from Appalachia, like writing about like Mexican characters in this really full, like wholehearted way, right? So I'm wondering how you dealt with that stuff in the drafting process.
No, thank you for your comments and for that question. I mean, I think that it is an important question, and I think I appreciate your perspective and you saying that it's brave. I mean, I do think that I did feel like I was taking a lot of risks with this book, and like the book was asking that of me, and that to undertake the project of this book. I mean, I think part of the reason I started writing it seriously writing it in 2015, but I had been taking notes on it for some years before that. And a big part of the process for me was kind of overcoming like some fears about the validity for myself of writing this, and part of that was approaching. So the character of Elana in the book is a character who like her biography resembles mine the most, as in she is a young white woman from Appalachia. And I think I could have tried to convince myself that I should have written the book entirely from her perspective, because her perspective is more similar to my own. And I had conversations with myself about that, but it didn't feel like it was doing the story justice. It felt like I was chickening out, quite honestly. And so what I dug into was I kind of dug into that doubt. And there was this point in my process where I read this interview with the poet Kwame Dawes, where he talked about, he had written a series of poems from the perspective of a group of folks who are HIV positive. And he had written these poems. And then there was an interview with him where he was talking about someone who had asked him about that, about him writing from a perspective that was not his own lived experience. And the way that he talked about empathy and creativity, and empathy as this very like active ingredient in his creativity. And there was something when I read that really sparked in my mind that idea of like empathy as this active part of creativity, that made me feel like I had to try to do it, and I had to try to do it right. And that if I failed and it didn't come out as a book and it didn't work, then fine, but I had to try to give it my all. And part of that was like leaning into the doubt. So every time that I doubted that I could write Alex or Mateo, whose lived experiences are quite different than my own, I would just try to dig deeper. So I would ask myself, okay, I'm having doubt in this moment. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe I should go back over that section and ask myself, what am I doing here? Am I thinking deeply enough? Am I using empathy as like a real muscle in my creativity, not a passive thing? thinking also about empathy versus sympathy, and the differences there. And not that sympathy is a bad thing, but I think that in certain ways empathy can be a little like more active. Like I'm not, I don't think that I have not had these lived experiences, but can I, part of the act of creativity, part of the act of fiction is imagining things. And I do think there's limits on what we can imagine, but we can push those limits, and listen to our gut. And so I tried to like really lean into doubt. And it's something that I kind of want to take forward. And you were talking about teaching, and it's something I think I want to tell my students more, and I want to tell myself more, even in future projects when maybe I'm writing characters who maybe, are on the surface kind of seem more like me. Even so, like doubting myself is not a bad thing. It's maybe a painful thing. And it's not always a happy thing, but I think that doubt was a huge part of my process for this book, and it was very, very fruitful. It meant that everything from just my own doubting myself and going back over passages, but then also giving the manuscript to writers who I trust, who have lived experiences that are more like the characters in the book, and like really listening and never assuming. I think there were parts of Sugar Run, because it was set in a fictional town that's basically a version of my own hometown, where I felt I had this confidence, and maybe it was deserved, maybe that's fine, right? But I don't think that confidence is the fiction writer's best friend. Like I think it always feels nice to be confident, right? But I actually think that doubt is often our better friend. So yeah, a whole lot of doubt is kind of how I did it.
Well, then I think that, like, so here, like, right, the relationship between like creativity and empathy, like that makes sense too. But even just in a like basic way, I felt like when I was reading the sections between Alex and Mateo, right? These like tender, loving scenes, because in like a lot of ways are the most beautiful sections of the book, I think. Like like I don't know, you wrote it so true, right? Like you just wrote towards this just true understanding of love and beauty and like desire and like want, right? That are universal, right? And I feel like that's like what I felt was like, how did she pull this off? And it's just that's how, right? Like,
well, I'm glad to hear that, but I think that's it. It's like digging under. I mean, that's what I heard in the interview with Kwame Dawes, is that I mean, there are no universal experiences, right? Like we each have our own very distinct experiences, but at the same time, like, so I have never been a young gay man, but I have felt this type of longing that I think was true to Alex, in a way. And I would try to tap deeply into that, getting rid of all of the exterior and just like diving into that like core emotion. Yeah.
Well, because we've all, well, hopefully we've all like been in a situation where we've like finally been alone with the person that we love, right? Like after like a long absence, like just the moment when you're just finally like in the room with the person that you love, and like you just that whatever, however you want to describe that gravitational pull or something, right?
Yes.
Like that's it's a universal feeling, right? Maybe the experience isn't, but like that, that's just people being together. So I think that one, and I'll just like a quick reminder to, because I have a few more questions, a quick reminder if you have any like questions that you want us to ask about like anything, really. I guess not, it doesn't have to be book related. You can throw it in the Q&A. But I want to talk about the title for a second, because I was fortunate enough to read this book like months ago, before it came out, and was fortunate again to kind of look it back over in the last couple of days. And the title of Perpetual West is so good, like this idea. And I just want to read something, and this is from Alex's notes. It's towards the end of the book, but I don't think it's like actually spoiling anything.
Yeah,
But
it's okay.
Alex's like notes where Elena is like found notes Alex is taking on this project. And I'll just read a second here. A theory he's calling Perpetual West. This idea that for those Americans who are still caught up in some form of the frontier thesis and manifest destiny, Mexico is the final and perpetual frontier, a place of eternal contrast that America can always compare itself favorably to. Mexico as the ultimate crucible for the formation of individual identity, a great plow to break yourself against and find out who you really are. To be a gringo in Mexico, that is euthanasia. So I wonder, did that idea, which is Alex's idea in the book, but did that come to you? Well, I guess what stage of the writing process did Alex writing that down come to you as like an explanation of not just the happenings in the book, but of just an American's relationship with Mexico? If you can even remember.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that like many things in this book, it was like a synthesis of both, like things like that, like the actual figuring out how to word that came rather late, but it was all drawn from like ideas I was trying to work through from the time like back in 2005 when I actually lived there. So I actually went back and looked at like journals that I had kept and things I tried to write down during that time period. And I knew that I wanted to use Alex as kind of like a mouthpiece in a way for certain ideas, because like he was a character who's like trying to engage with the experience of living on the border in a very explicit way. Like he was born in Juárez and he was raised somewhere else and he comes back, and he's the fact that he was like in an academic program, he's in a sociology program. This was one of the things that felt like very kind of liberating to me in contrast to Sugar Run, was that I had characters who could like say things like that part you just read, because like he's an academic, he's a graduate student, right? It would have made absolutely no sense if I tried to have the characters in Sugar Run say something like that, because like it's not, it doesn't match up. And it's not like I want to write like that all the time, but it was kind of nice to have the flexibility to have characters be able to like believably pontificate in a way. And so I was looking back through and looking at my own notes on all of these different experiences. So the very opening of the book, there's this little scene in the opening of the book where there's this couple who are crossing the border in front of Alex and Elana, and they have their van stuffed full of groceries because they decided that they were going to like make a getaway and go to Mexico, but then they realized that they couldn't use their like food stamps EBT card in Mexico. So they came back and like maxed it out and filled up their van and then went down there. And that was drawn from like a real life experience of seeing that. And then there's also another point in the book where there's this exchange student who is in Juárez, and she doesn't speak very good Spanish, and she's dating this guy, and she's having Elana translate for her. And that was also something that was like a real life experience to me. And so in my journals, I think I was trying to like work through including myself, what was I wanting from this experience, and what were all of these like these very different types of Americans who I came across in the time that I was there. It seemed as if there was something that everyone was wanting from Mexico. And so that was my attempt through Alex to try to like put that into words, was this way of like, there's something about like trying to define oneself kind of against Mexico or in conversation with. There was something that I felt like a lot of people, and honestly probably myself too, were trying to work through as far as like identity and self-reflection, and we were like using Mexico in our kind of personal journey, and that bit from Alex's notes for his thesis was my best attempt at trying to like articulate what it is that at least some of us Americans have tried to do there in the border region, like going south. What is it that we're seeking? And I don't know that I have the perfect answer for that, but I think that I really wanted to like pose that question.
Yeah. Well, I think that if nothing else, it gave you a pretty awesome title too.
Yes. Well, thank you. I felt like I really loved the title. I had to like argue for it a bit. I mean, there was some folks who thought that it was like too vague. And I was like, maybe, okay, you don't know what it is until you get into the book, but yes, if not, I think it works.
Well, and so you're going, I guess you said before you started, you said you're going back to Mexico City soon.
Yeah.
Like how, through the writing of this book, like has your relationship changed with Mexico, like evolved? Like how, I don't know, how does it feel to kind of go back to this place now?
Yeah, so I think that like prior to working on this book, it had been years since I'd gone back to Mexico, and then as I had mentioned, I like reconnected through Facebook with Pagano, this wrestler, and I'm actually going to see him. He has a fight in Mexico City on the 18th.
Oh, sweet.
And the woman who I had all those years ago fallen in love with, who I'm now like happily friends with, is living in Mexico City right now. So I'm going down to meet up with her, and we're going to go see Pagano fight on the 18th. So I think in a way it's like reanimated certain relationships, and I'm really excited to bring Pagano a copy of the book. I mean, it's not at this point, there's no plans for it to be translated. I mean, I would love for it to be translated into Spanish, but even just giving him a physical copy of the book, I think feels like a big deal to me, because he was both of them were so instrumental in like the ways that this narrative came to be. So I feel like it'll be, and I'm gonna go back. So I spent like 2 months in like 2018 in Mexico City, and I'm gonna go see my Airbnb host, who was amazing and like really did everything she could to help me in my research and in my writing while I was there. I just messaged her, and she's like, I'm going to meet up with her and give her a copy of the book. And so I feel like it'll be really nice to kind of like circle back around and be like, I did it. I wrote the book. It exists. Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
So I think that like for the last few minutes, I'm really interested to hear on what you're doing now, right? Because you said you started a third book. Where does in what far-flung place does this one occur?
Well, this one, so like landscape setting wise, it's back in West Virginia, but it feels pretty far-flung to me in terms of it's written in second person and second and first person. So I wrote like a super messy first draft of this in the first couple of months of the pandemic. Like this has never happened to me before, but it like in like 3 months, it just kind of like came out. And it's a shorter novel than Perpetual West, but I didn't trust that. Like I was like, whoa, I've never written anything this fast. And so I sat on it for a while, and had some folks who I trust read it and went back over it. But I recently just showed it to my agent and was like, you know what, if this is like total crap, like just tell me, and he was like, no, it's not at all. So I'm diving back into edits of that, and it's a young couple in West Virginia who are dealing with it's in the like the opioid epidemic and like gender identity, and so it's back in West Virginia again, but the new territory really feels like Like, for whatever reason, it's telling me it needs to be written mostly in second person, and that's new territory for me. So yeah.
Oh, that sounds so cool. And so you said that you start with like an image, right? Like your books have started with an image. What can you tell us what the first image for this third book was?
Yeah, so the first image for this was like someone's ear against someone's chest. And when I pulled the frame out from that, it was this two young people in the backseat of a car, listening to music really loud through the stereo, and there's a river going by. And there, yeah, the one has her ear to the other woman's chest, and is like listening really intently to her heartbeat. So yeah, there's again themes of desire and like some things like that. But that's kind of where it started. And yeah, it does for me. It really begins with an image, and I really feel like I have to like physically get in there and open the aperture in a way, like be like, okay, so here is this image, but what's happening outside of that, and what about outside of that? So that's then my process of exploration.
All right, cool. Well, I can't wait to read it.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's as good of a place as any.
Yeah.
It's not enough people have some lingering questions they want to get out, but thanks so much, Mesha.
Thank you, Gabe. Thank you. This is wonderful.
Thanks, Mesha, and thanks, Gabriel, for doing this event with us tonight. I'm going to post a link in the chat to our YouTube channel. This event will be going up on our YouTube page sometime tomorrow. If you have friends that you want to check it out, or somebody who missed it tonight, they can always watch it tomorrow or anytime on our YouTube channel. You can find all of our other past events there as well. This is Mesha's book right here. Great. I love all the little things.
I know. I feel it's
so
such
big.
a gorgeous cover. They got like a wallpaper artist. The Dan Funderburg, like that's his main thing, is he does wallpaper.
It's great, and the Mexican wrestling masks. Really beautiful. This is Gabriel's book. It's in paperback. This is the hardcover. Paperback is out too. I was looking through this book earlier today when I was working the info desk, and had a lot of fun reading through this. So excited to meet you.
It's an amazing novel.
At the store, Gabriel, and Mesha. I hope you get to come back to the store someday soon too.
Yes.
So all right. Well, thank you both again for joining us, and thanks everyone at home for watching. And have a great night.
Yeah,
thank you.
Have a good night, everyone. Hopefully see you soon, Mesha.
Thank you. Yes.